Her brothers sold her to the rival pack, unaware the Alpha King had dreamed of her his entire life. The heavy iron lock clicked shut, a sound final enough to sever a bloodline. Sinclair Moorcrest didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked through the rusted bars of the carriage at the brother she had nursed through fever, the brother she had starved to feed. Thorn Ashwell didn't meet her gaze. He was too busy counting the heavy sack of gold coins tossed to him by the Stonehaven guards. "It's just business, Sin," Thorn muttered to the rain-soaked earth. "The pack has to eat." But as the carriage lurched forward, dragging her toward the territory of the monsters, Sinclair knew the truth. She wasn't just sold, she was sacrificed. The rain in the Moorcrest territories always tasted of iron and rot. It was a dying land, governed by dying men with desperate ambitions. Sinclair Moorcrest sat in the corner of the rattling transport cage, her knees pulled to her chest, her thin linen dress offering no protection against the biting wind slicing through the wooden slats. She wasn't crying. Tears were a luxury the Omega of the Moorcrest pack could rarely afford. Instead, she was cataloguing her regrets. Her brother, Thorn Ashwell, sat atop his horse a few yards away, watching the exchange. Thorn, with his sharp jawline and sharper ambition, had inherited the leadership of their crumbling pack only 6 months ago. Since then, he had gambled away their reserves, alienated their allies, and now he had sold their own flesh and blood to settle a debt. "Is she healthy?" The voice came from a hulking brute of a man wearing the slate-grey armour of the Stonehaven pack. The emblem of the mountain wolf was etched into his pauldron, a symbol that struck terror into anyone born in the valleys. "She's an Omega," Thorn replied, his voice devoid of the warmth he used to feign when they were children playing in the creek. "Resilient. Quiet. She cooks, she mends, she endures. She'll serve your king well." She endures. Sinclair closed her eyes. That was her legacy. The quiet daughter, the invisible sister. While her brothers, Thorn and the younger, wilder Bram, postured and fought, Sinclair kept the manor standing. She scrubbed the floors until her hands bled. She brewed the tonics that kept their elders breathing. And this was her reward. "The king doesn't need a servant," the Stonehaven guard grunted, tossing a heavy leather sack toward Thorn. It landed with a dull, heavy thud in the mud. "He needs collateral. If your pack crosses the border again, Ashwell, the girl pays the price." Thorn dismounted to retrieve the gold, his greed overshadowing any flicker of familial guilt. He weighed the sack, finally looking up to catch Sinclair's eye through the bars. For a fleeting second, he looked like the boy who used to hide behind her skirts during thunderstorms. Then, the alpha mask slipped back into place. "Don't look at me like that, Sinclair," he called out, the wind snatching his words. "You're going to a palace. You'll eat better there than you ever did here. I'm doing you a favor." "You're selling me to Ryland Stonehaven," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "You're selling me to the butcher." Legends of the Stonehaven Alpha, King Rylan, were whispered in the dark to frighten children. They said he was more beast than man, a shifter whose wolf had consumed his human soul. They said he was cold, unfeeling, a warrior who had united the northern territories through sheer brutality. He had no mate, no queen, only a fortress of ice and stone. The guard signaled the driver. The carriage lurched. Sinclair didn't look back at the crumbling manor of her ancestors. She didn't look at Thorn clutching his blood money. She looked forward, into the mist, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent her life being invisible to survive. Now, she was being delivered to the center of the spotlight, a hostage in a king's court. As the carriage crossed the boundary line, a visceral shift in the air pressure that made her ears pop. Sinclair felt a strange sensation wash over her. It wasn't fear, though she was terrified. It was a hum, a vibration in her very bones, as if a tuning fork had been struck deep within her chest. She rubbed her sternum, frowning. The air here was different. It didn't smell of rot. It smelled of pine, ozone, and something ancient. Something waiting. High above the valley, in the obsidian keep, Ryland Stonehaven stood on the balcony of his private quarters, overlooking the sprawling expanse of his kingdom. The wind whipped at his dark hair, but he didn't feel the cold. He rarely felt the cold anymore. My king? Ryland didn't turn. He knew the scent of his beta, Ulara Moore, well, before she even stepped into the room. Ulara was his aunt, a sharp-tongued, formidable woman who had served as his advisor since his parents were slaughtered in the Great War. "The payment has been delivered," Ulara said, her voice echoing in the vast stone chamber. The Moorcrest boy took the gold without hesitation. The hostage is crossing the bridge now. Ryland's grip on the stone railing tightened, his knuckles turning white. "I did not ask for a hostage, Ulara. I asked for their surrender." "A hostage ensures it," Ulara replied pragmatically, pouring herself a goblet of wine. "Thorn Ashwell is a snake. He will bite the moment our backs are turned. Holding his sister ensures his fangs stay sheathed." Ryland sighed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate from the stone floor. He rubbed his temples. The headache was back. The same headache that had plagued him for 5 years. "The dreams?" Ulara asked softly, her tone shifting from advisor to aunt. "Vivid," Ryland admitted. "Last night. It was clearer than ever." For 5 years, the Alpha King had been haunted, not by ghosts of the battlefield, but by a woman he had never met. In the dream, he was always running through a dense, silver fog. He could smell her, wildflowers and rain, and he could hear her breathing. Sometimes he saw flashes, a delicate wrist, a curve of a neck, eyes the color of storm clouds. But he never saw her face. The pull was agony. His wolf, a massive midnight black beast, paced restlessly within his mind, howling for a mate that didn't exist. The healers called it mate madness, a delusion of a lonely mind. But Ryland knew it was real. He felt her absence like a phantom limb. "Perhaps she is near," Ulara suggested, though she sounded skeptical. "The gathering is next month. Alphas from all territories will bring their eligible daughters." "It isn't a high-born lady, Ulara," Ryland growled, turning to face her. His eyes, a piercing amber, flashed with irritation. "The woman in the dream. She is in pain, she is trapped, and I cannot find her." A commotion from the courtyard below drew his attention. The heavy iron gates of the keep were groaning open. The carriage from the Moorcrest lands had arrived. Ryland looked down. From this height, the people were like ants. He saw the guards opening the back of the transport cage. A small figure stepped out. Even from hundreds of feet up, he saw she was slight, dressed in rags that fluttered in the wind. Then, the wind shifted. It carried the scent up the mountain face, swirling over the balcony, hitting Ryland with the force of a physical blow. Wildflowers, rain, sorrow. Ryland froze. His heart stopped, then restarted with a violent kick that knocked the breath from his lungs. His inner wolf slammed against his ribcage, roaring a single word that shattered his composure. "Mine. My king." Ulara stepped forward, alarmed by the sudden tension radiating off him. "Ryland, your eyes have gone black." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The world had narrowed down to that single, small figure shivering in the courtyard mud. The woman from the mist. The ghost that had haunted his sleep for 5 years. She was here, and she smelled like fear. Without a word to his aunt, Ryland Stonehaven vaulted over the balcony railing. It was a 40-foot drop to the lower terrace, but he landed in a crouch, the stone cracking beneath his boots and immediately broke into a sprint toward the courtyard. Sinclair stumbled as she was pulled from the carriage. Her legs were numb from the cramped journey. The courtyard of the Obsidian Keep was terrifying, walls of black stone that seemed to scrape the sky, filled with warriors who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Move it, Wolfless," a guard muttered, shoving her shoulder. Sinclair barely kept her footing. She kept her head down, staring at the muddy cobblestones. "Invisibility is survival," she chanted internally. "Don't look them in the eye. Don't speak unless spoken to." Suddenly, the bustling noise of the courtyard died. Silence fell like a guillotine. The guard who had shoved her gasped and dropped to one knee. Sinclair sensed the shift in the air, the static charge of immense power approaching. The puddle in front of her face rippled from heavy, approaching footsteps. A pair of black leather boots stopped inches from her nose. Sinclair stopped breathing. The aura radiating from this man was suffocating. It was dark, heavy, and smelled of wood smoke and something undeniably masculine. It compelled her to submit, to bare her neck, to cower. But it also compelled her to lean in. "Look at me." The voice was low, rough, like gravel grinding together. It wasn't a request. Trembling, Sinclair defied every instinct telling her to flee and slowly lifted her head. She looked up. And up. He was massive. Broad shoulders spanned a chest covered in a black tunic. His face was sharp angles and rough stubble, a warrior's face, scarred and hardened. But it was his eyes that pinned her in place. They were amber, burning with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Ryland stared at her. He felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. It was her. The grime on her face couldn't hide the curve of her jaw. The rags she wore couldn't disguise the scent that was currently driving his wolf into a frenzy. This was the woman he had dreamed of. But she was broken. He saw the bruises on her wrists where the manacles had been. He saw the hollowness of her cheeks, the haunted look in her storm-grey eyes. She wasn't a queen arriving to be claimed. She was a prisoner sold for a bag of gold. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. Not at her, at the world that had dared to touch what belonged to him. "Who did this to you?" Ryland demanded. His voice was too loud, too aggressive. Sinclair flinched, interpreting his rage as directed at her. She shrank back, curling in on herself. I am sorry, Alpha. I am Sinclair Moorcrest. I am the payment." The payment. The words sliced through Rylan. He looked at the guard who had brought her. "You chained her." The guard, sensing the lethal shift in his king's mood, stammered. "Standard protocol for hostages, sire." Her brother said. "Her brother," Ryland snarled, "is a dead man walking." He turned back to Sinclair. He wanted to reach out, to touch her face, to verify she was real, but he saw the terror in her eyes. She thought he was the monster the stories claimed. If he touched her now, with his control hanging by a thread, he might frighten her to death. He had to get her away from the guards. He had to hide her until he could understand why the fates had given him a rival's sister as his soulmate. "Verity!" Rylan bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. A woman with kind eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves hurried forward from the infirmary wing. She was the pack's head healer, and one of the few people who didn't fear Rylan. "Take her," Rylan ordered, gesturing to Sinclair. He couldn't look at her anymore. The temptation to grab her and run to his private den was too strong. "Take her to the East Wing, the Sun Suite." Verity's eyes widened. "The Sun Suite. Sire, those are the Queen's chambers. They haven't been opened in—" "Do it!" Rylan roared, his control snapping. Sinclair flinched violently. Rylan saw it, and instant regret washed over him. He lowered his voice, forcing a harsh whisper. "Feed her. Bathe her. If anyone touches her, they lose a hand. Is that clear?" "Crystal, my king, Verity said softly. She approached Sinclair, her demeanor gentle. "Come, child. You're shaking." Sinclair hesitated, looking from the gentle woman to the terrifying giant breathing heavily before her. She didn't understand. The East Wing? The Queen's chambers? Why wasn't she being thrown in the dungeon? "Go," Ryland said, turning his back to her, clutching his hands into fists to stop himself from reaching out. "Get her out of my sight before I kill everyone in this courtyard." Sinclair scrambled to follow Verity, her heart pounding. She thought he hated her. She thought his rage was because she was a Moorcrest, a worthless Omega staining his courtyard. She didn't see Ryland collapse to his knees the moment she turned the corner, his hand clutching his chest where his heart was beating a frantic, joyous, terrified rhythm. Verity Ashcourt led Sinclair through corridors of polished obsidian and tapestries of silver thread. The castle wasn't a dungeon, it was a masterpiece, but to Sinclair it was just a prettier cage. "He didn't mean to scare you," Verity said quietly, as they climbed a winding staircase. "The king, he is intense, but he is not cruel. He looked like he wanted to tear my throat out," Sinclair whispered, hugging her elbows. Verity smiled enigmatically. "No, dear. That was the look of a starving man seeing a feast for the first time. Though I admit I've never seen him quite like that." They reached a set of double doors made of white oak, the only bright wood Sinclair had seen in the fortress. Verity pushed them open. Sinclair gasped. The room was enormous. A wall of glass overlooked the valley, letting in the golden light of the setting sun. There was a bed large enough for 5 people, draped in silk and furs. A fire crackled in a marble hearth. It smelled of lavender and safety. "This is a mistake," Sinclair said, backing up. "I'm a hostage. I'm supposed to be in a cell." "You are a guest of the king," Verity corrected, guiding her inside, "and Ryland Stonehaven does not keep guests in cells." Verity bustled about, ordering unseen servants to bring hot water and food. Within an hour, Sinclair was scrubbed clean of the road's mud, soaking in a copper tub that cost more than her brother's life. As she sank into the hot water, washing away the scent of the Moorcrest misery, she thought of the Alpha's amber eyes. She felt that hum in her chest again, stronger now. She was clean. She was fed. She was in a palace. But as she looked at the heavy lock on the oak door, she remembered Thorn's words. "I'm doing you a favor." She was a bird moved from a rusty cage to a golden one. But she was still a bird, and the hawk outside the door was hungry. Sinclair sank beneath the water, holding her breath, wondering how long she could hide from the monster who looked at her as if she were the only living thing in the world. She didn't know that 3 floors down, in the war room, Ryland Stonehaven was pinning a map of the Moorcrest lands to the table with a dagger. "Prepare the Legion," Ryland told Ulara, his voice deadly calm. "For defense?" Ulara asked. "No," Ryland said, staring at the border where Sinclair had been sold. "For retribution. They hurt her. They starved her. And now I'm going to burn their world down around them." The sun that hit the Sunsweet did not feel like the sun Sinclair knew. In the Moorcrest valleys, light was something to be hoarded, a rare, sickly break in the grey canopy of dying oaks. Here, at the peak of the Stonehaven territory, the morning light was violent, dazzling, reflecting off the snow-capped peaks and flooding her room with an exposure that made her want to hide under the massive down duvet. Sinclair had not slept well, despite the silk sheets that felt like cool water against her skin. Every creak of the castle settled into her bones as a threat. She had spent half the night staring at the fire, waiting for the door to open, waiting for the Alpha King to claim his property. But the door had remained shut, the heavy iron lock a silent sentinel. She woke to the sound of the heavy oak door unlocking, but it wasn't the stealthy click of a predator. It was the sharp, authoritative snap of a key, turning with purpose. She scrambled upright, clutching the sheet to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Instead of the king, a woman swept in. She was tall, statuesque, with hair the colour of spun gold pinned back in a severe, intricate braid that looked like a crown. Her eyes were shards of ice, cold and assessing. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet that hugged curves honed by both luxury and training, the fabric rustling like dry leaves. This was not a servant. This was a predator in silk. "So," the woman said, her voice a perfectly tuned instrument of disdain. She didn't bow. She didn't introduce herself. She simply walked to the foot of the bed and looked Sinclair up and down as if inspecting livestock at a discount auction. "This is the creature that cost us a sack of gold and the king's dignity." Sinclair stiffened. The insult acted like a spark to dry tinder, her pride flickering to life despite her fear. She had been sold, yes, but she was still the daughter of an alpha line, however fallen. "I am Sinclair Moorcrest." "I know who you are," the woman dismissed with a lazy wave of a manicured hand. "I am Lady Wendelane Fairvale. My father commands the King's Western Legion. I, in turn, command the social order of this keep. And you, little Omega, are a disruption." Wendelane began to circle the bed, her fingers trailing over the carved wood posts, invading Sinclair's sanctuary. "A Rylan, King Rylan, is a man of specific tastes. He needs a queen who can stand beside him in war, who can shift into a beast that rivals his own. He does not need a mouse that requires a gilded box to survive. Do not mistake his pity for affection, girl. He put you here because he doesn't know where else to put a broken thing." Sinclair lowered her gaze, gripping the sheets until her knuckles turned white. "I didn't ask to be here, Lady Fairvale. I was sold by my own blood. If I am a disruption, blame my brother, or blame your king for buying me. I am merely the currency." Wendelane stopped, her eyes narrowing. She hadn't expected the mouse to squeak. "Careful," she hissed, leaning in closer. "The king may have forbidden the guards from touching you, but accidents happen in a castle this large. Stairs are steep, stone is hard, and Omegas are so very fragile." She snapped her fingers, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the large room. Two maids hurried in, heads bowed, carrying a tray of food and a pile of clothing. "Get dressed," Wendelane commanded, checking her nails. "The king demands your presence for the midday meal. Try not to look so destitute. It reflects poorly on the pack's investment." With a final, withering sneer, Wendelane swept out, leaving the scent of expensive rose oil and malice in her wake. Sinclair looked at the clothes the maids had laid out. They were beautiful. Soft wools in shades of slate and silver, the Stonehaven colours embroidered with subtle thread that caught the light. But as she dressed, fumbling with the unfamiliar clasps, she felt the weight of Wendelane's words. Pity. Of course it was pity. Why else would a king look at her? She was a bargaining chip, a charity case. When the guards escorted her to the dining hall, Sinclair kept her head high, though her knees knocked together beneath the heavy skirts. The hall was a cavernous space, dominated by a long table made of black ironwood, polished to a mirror shine. Tapestries depicting great wolf battles hung from the ceiling, dwarfing the occupants. Rylan sat at the head of the table. He looked more like a part of the architecture than a man, immobile, massive, carved from shadow and stone. He was reading a scroll, his brow furrowed, radiating that same intense, dark energy she had felt in the courtyard. He looked up as she entered. The scroll crumbled in his fist, the parchment groaning under the pressure. For a moment, neither spoke. Rylan took in the sight of her. Clean, dressed in his colours, her hair falling in soft, dark waves around her face. She looked like a queen. His queen. His wolf purred so loudly in his chest he feared the vibration would shatter the wine goblets. "Sit," Rylan grunted. The word came out harsher than he intended, because he was using every ounce of his willpower to suppress the urge to run to her, pull her into his lap, and scent her neck until the smell of the Moorcrest pack was gone forever. Sinclair sat at the far end of the table, at least 20 feet away. Rylan stared at her. "Closer," he commanded. She moved one seat up. Rylan sighed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed like a distant rock slide. "Sinclair, I am not going to eat you. Sit here." He pointed to the chair at his immediate right hand, a seat of honor. Trembling, she obeyed. As she approached, the air grew thicker, charged with static. Up close, he was overwhelming. The heat coming off him was palpable, a furnace contained within skin. She could smell the soap he used, sandalwood, steel, and the faint, woodsy scent of the forest floor. "Did you sleep?" he asked, pushing a plate of roasted fowl, seasoned potatoes, and fresh bread toward her. His voice was low, intimate, cutting through the vast space of the hall. "Yes, Your Majesty," she lied, keeping her eyes on the plate. "Liar," he murmured. There was no heat in the accusation, only a strange, tired amusement. "You paced until 3 in the morning. I could hear your heartbeat. It skips when you are anxious." Sinclair froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked up, startled. You could hear me? From your chambers?" "I hear everything in my territory," Rylan said simply, tearing a piece of bread, but not eating it. His amber eyes were locked onto hers, reading every micro-expression. "But I hear you, clearly. It is distinct." Sinclair flushed. "I am sorry if I kept you awake." "You didn't," Rylan said. "Because I haven't slept in 5 years," he didn't say. "Verity tells me you are skilled in herbology. You identified the salve she used on your wrists before she even opened the jar." I had to be," Sinclair stammered, feeling the intensity of his focus. "Our healer died years ago. We couldn't afford another. I read his books. I did what I could for the pack." "We have a vast library," Rylan said. "The archives of the Northern Alphas going back centuries. It is yours to use. You are not a prisoner, Sinclair. I want you to understand that. You are under my protection." Sinclair put her fork down. The metal clinked sharply against the china. "For how long?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Until my brother pays the debt? Or until I serve whatever purpose you bought me for? Gwendoline made it clear I am an investment." Rylan's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. "Gwendoline speaks when she should listen. I did not buy you for a purpose, Sinclair. I bought you to save your life. Do you think I don't know what Thorn was planning? He was going to sell you to the Southern slavers if I didn't take the deal. I bought your freedom." "You bought my transfer," she corrected him, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Freedom doesn't have a lock on the door." Rylan stared at her, stunned by her defiance. Most wolves cowered before him. Even his generals hesitated to meet his gaze when he was in a mood. But this small, fragile Omega, who had been beaten down by life and starvation, was looking him in the eye and challenging him. A slow, terrifyingly attractive smile spread across Rylan's face. It transformed him from a statue into a man. "Fair point," he rumbled. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a heavy iron key on a velvet ribbon. He slid it across the table until it rested against her hand. "The key to your suite. Lock it from the inside, if you wish. Or leave it open. Throw it out the window. The choice is yours." Sinclair stared at the key. It was cold and heavy. She looked back at him, confused. "Why?" she whispered. Because, Ryland said, his voice dropping to a husky timbre that sent shivers down her spine, I have waited a very long time for someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth to me. I would hate to lock that away. Weeks passed, and the Obsidian Keep began to feel less like a prison and more like a puzzle Sinclair was slowly solving. The rhythm of the castle was different from the chaotic desperation of Moorcrest. Here there was order, there was food, there was safety. She avoided Wendelin Fairvale, who watched her from shadows with eyes like daggers, and spent her time in the library or the infirmary, helping Verity. The healer had become a tentative friend, teaching Sinclair the properties of the mountain herbs that grew in the high altitude. Rylan was a constant, looming presence. He didn't summon her again, but he was always there. If she was in the library, she would find a fire already roaring in the hearth and a fresh pot of tea waiting, her favorite blend, chamomile and honey. If she walked in the gardens, she would sense eyes on her from the balconies above. He was courting her, though she didn't recognize it. To her, it felt like being stalked by a very large, very polite apex predator. He left things for her. A warm fur cloak on a bench when the wind picked up. A rare book on botany left on her nightstand. He never handed them to her directly, as if he feared she would flinch away. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, threatening a mountain storm. Sinclair was in the castle gardens, a sprawling labyrinth of winter-blooming moonflowers, hardy pines, and jagged rock formations. She was kneeling in the dirt, examining a patch of wolfsbane that had been trampled. It wasn't an accident, a deep voice said from above her. Sinclair jumped, nearly dropping her trowel. Rylan was standing on the stone path, wearing a heavy fur-lined cloak that made him look even broader than usual. He looked tired. The shadows under his eyes were dark purple bruises. "My king," she breathed, scrambling to stand and dusting the soil from her skirts. "Don't," he said, waving a hand. "Stay. You'll look peaceful." "I am looking at the wolfsbane," she explained, gesturing to the crushed plants. "Someone stepped on these deliberately. The roots are severed. It takes force to do that." "Wendelin," Rylan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She has a petty streak. She knows you favor the gardens. She thinks if she destroys what you like, you will wither and leave." "She hates me," Sinclair stated. "She fears you," Rylan corrected. He stepped off the path, his boots sinking into the soft earth, moving into her personal space. The garden seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, enveloped by the scent of ozone and pine. "She fears what you represent. And what is that?" Sinclair looked up at him, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "I am nothing to her. I am a hostage." Rylan reached out. For the first time, he touched her. His large, rough hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the stray hair. The contact was electric. Sinclair gasped, a jolt of heat zipping straight to her core, making her knees weak. Rylan's pupils dilated until his eyes were almost black. The contact with her skin quieted the roaring in his head for the first time in 5 years. The constant, aching need that drove his mate madness vanished, replaced by a profound, terrifying sense of rightness. "Change," Rylan murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You represent change, Sinclair. My pack is built on strength, on war. They don't know what to do with someone who fights with gentleness. You terrify them because they don't know how to defeat you." Sinclair leaned into his hand unconsciously. The hum in her chest was now a deafening drumbeat. She felt safe. Standing in the shadow of the monster, she felt safer than she ever had in her own home. "You're shaking," Rylan noticed, his thumb caressing her cheekbone, marveling at the softness of her skin. "I'm not cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Rylan smiled, a genuine soft expression that transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly handsome. "No, you're not." He leaned in. The air between them crackled. Sinclair's eyelids fluttered shut. She wanted him to close the distance. She wanted to know if he tasted like the storm he smelled of. She wanted to know why her soul felt like it was singing a duet with his. Crack. A sound like a gunshot tore through the air. Rylan moved faster than thought. He didn't look up. He just reacted. He grabbed Sinclair, wrapping his massive body around hers and spinning them away, shielding her with his own back. A massive branch from the ancient oak tree above them crashed to the ground, exactly where she had been standing, landing with a bone-shaking thud. Leaves and splinters exploded outward. They tumbled into the soft grass, Rylan taking the brunt of the impact. He landed on his back. Sinclair sprawled on top of him, his arms locked around her waist like iron bands. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the first heavy drops of rain hitting the leaves. Sinclair pushed herself up, her hands resting on his chest. She could feel the hard muscle beneath the tunic, the rapid, sledgehammer thud of his heart. "Rylan, are you hurt?" Rylan groaned, but it wasn't from pain. Having her pressed against him, her soft curves against his hardness, her scent filling his nose, was agony of the best kind. "I'm fine," he gritted out, his voice strained. He looked over her shoulder at the fallen branch. His eyes narrowed. The break was clean. Sawed. "That was cut," he growled, the alpha tone returning instantly, vibrating through his chest and into her hands. He sat up, taking her with him, setting her gently on the grass before standing up and pulling her to her feet. His face was thunderous, his eyes shifting to the glowing gold of the wolf. "Go to your room," he ordered, his eyes scanning the balconies and windows of the keep, searching for movement. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but Verity or Ulara." "Rylan, go," he roared, the command vibrating in the air, a king's order that could not be disobeyed. Sinclair fled, clutching her skirts. But as she ran back to the safety of the keep, she looked back once. Rylan was standing in the pouring rain, staring up at the high tower where Wendelane's quarters were located. His hands were curled into fists, and he looked every bit the king prepared to burn down his own castle to kill the rats inside. The storm broke that night, with a fury that shook the foundations of the obsidian keep. Sinclair obeyed the king. She locked her door and huddled by the fire, listening to the thunder and the howling wind that sounded too much like wolves. But by the second day of confinement, curiosity and boredom outweighed fear. Rylan hadn't come. Verity brought meals but said little, her face drawn and worried. "The king is occupied," was all the healer would say, avoiding Sinclair's eyes. "There are political complications, an investigation." On the third afternoon, the rain had settled into a grey drizzle. Sinclair slipped out. The halls were empty. Most of the pack was gathered in the lower training grounds for some assembly. She could hear distant shouting. She wandered the upper corridors, the silence of the keep amplifying her footsteps. She found herself in the west wing, the oldest part of the castle, a place the servants avoided. The air here was still and cold, smelling of dust and oil paint. At the end of a long hallway stood a single narrow door made of iron-bound wood. Unlike every other door in the castle, this one was slightly ajar. Sinclair knew she should turn back, but the hum in her chest, that strange magnetic pull that had started the moment she crossed the border, was dragging her toward it. It was the same feeling she had when she looked at Rylan. Something waiting. She pushed the door open. It was a tower room, circular and lined with windows that offered a panoramic view of the storm-lashed mountains. But Sinclair didn't look at the view. She looked at the walls. They were covered in canvases, hundreds of them. Some were framed in gold, some were just pinned charcoal sketches, Others were rough paintings on stretched hide. They were all of her. Sinclair put a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. She stumbled into the room, her eyes darting from one image to the next. There was a sketch of a girl crying by a creek. She remembered that day. She was 12, and Thorn had killed her pet rabbit. The artist had captured the exact shade of grief in her eyes. There was a painting of a young woman staring out a rainy window, her hand pressed to the glass. She did that every time it rained, wishing for a way out of Moorcrest. There was a charcoal drawing of her sleeping, her hair fanned out on a pillow she recognized from her room, back at her brother's manor. He had seen it all. Every moment of sorrow, every private tear, every silent wish. He had documented her life while she thought she was invisible. "I told myself I wouldn't let you see this," a voice said from the shadows of the stairwell. Sinclair spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Ryland stood there. He looked wrecked. His tunic was unlaced, revealing the dark hair on his chest. His hair was wild, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. He held a bottle of amber liquor loosely in one hand. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days because he was terrified of what he might see when he closed his eyes. "You—" Sinclair backed up until she hit a table covered in paints and brushes. "You've been watching me." "Dreaming," Ryland corrected, stepping into the light. "I have been dreaming of you for 5 years, Sinclair. Every night. I close my eyes, and I am with you. I feel what you feel. I taste your sadness. I wake up reaching for you, and my hands find only air." He gestured helplessly to the room, the bottle sloshing. "I tried to draw you to get you out of my head, to prove you weren't real, to exorcise the ghost. But the more I drew, the more real you became. The more I loved you." "Why didn't you come for me?" Sinclair whispered, tears pricking her eyes. The violation was immense, but so was the intimacy. He had been with her in her darkest moments. He was the only witness to her life. "I didn't know where you were," Ryland shouted, the frustration breaking through his calm facade. He slammed the bottle down on a shelf, the glass cracking. "I saw a room, a creek, a window. I didn't know it was Moorcrest land. I searched the south, the east. I never thought to look in the one place I was forbidden to go. I never thought my soulmate would be born to my enemies." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her. He smelled of rain and whiskey and despair. "When I saw you in that cage," Ryland said, his voice cracking, "I thought I had gone mad. I thought the spirits were mocking me. But then I smelled you. Wildflowers and rain." He reached out, his hand trembling, and traced the line of her jaw. "You are my mate, Sinclair. My soul is tethered to yours. If you die, I become a beast forever. If you leave, I will burn the world to find you." Sinclair stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just a romance. This was a supernatural obsession. It was terrifying, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "I'm a Moorcrest," she whispered. "My blood is your enemy. Your blood is my life," Ryland swore. He leaned his forehead against hers. "Thorn knows. That's why he sold you. He didn't just sell a sister. He sold a weapon. He knew that once I saw you, once I scented you, I would be compromised." "Compromised?" "Distracted," Ryland murmured, closing his eyes, inhaling her scent like oxygen. "Vulnerable. Because now, all he has to do to destroy the King of the North is hurt you." As if summoned by his words, a sound tore through the intimacy of the moment. The deep, guttural boom of war horns echoed from the valley below, bouncing off the stone walls of the keep. Ryland's head snapped up. His eyes shifted instantly from human amber to the glowing gold of the wolf. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the mask of the warlord. "He's here," Ryland growled. Sinclair ran to the window. Down in the valley, through the mist and rain, she saw torches, thousands of them, snaking through the pass like a river of fire. The Moorcrest banner flew alongside the flags of 3 other packs, mercenaries, rogues, enemies of the crown. Thorn hadn't just sold her. He had used the gold to buy an army, and he had used the time to let Rylan fall in love, knowing that a king in love is a king with a weakness. Rylan stepped up behind her, his large body shielding her from the view of the approaching army. "Stay in this room," Rylan commanded, his voice cold and hard as stone. "Do not leave. Do not look out the window. I will send Ulara to guard the door." "Rylan, what are you going to do?" She grabbed his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. He turned at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the lightning flashing outside. "I am going to remind your brother," Rylan said, baring his teeth in a smile that promised no mercy, "why the Stonehaven wolf is the symbol of death. And then, I am going to bring you his head." He slammed the door, the lock clicking shut, leaving Sinclair alone with 1,000 images of her own face, while the drums of war began to beat a death march below. The battle for the Obsidian Keep did not begin with a roar, but with a shudder. The ground beneath the castle groaned as thousands of boots and paws marched against the stone foundations. From her high tower window, Sinclair watched the valley floor transform into a churning sea of violence. Rylan was out there. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her heart aching with a physical pull toward the man who had just confessed 5 years of longing. She could see his wolf form, a massive, midnight black beast tearing through the front lines of the mercenary army like a wraith. He was death incarnate, unstoppable and terrifying, but he was outnumbered. "You should not be watching, little mouse." The voice came from inside the room. Sinclair spun around. The heavy door, which Rylan had locked, swung open. Standing in the threshold was not Ulara, the king's aunt, but Lady Wendelane Fairvale. Wendelane wore a breastplate over her velvet gown and held a short, wicked-looking silver dagger. Her eyes were bright with madness. "Where is Ulara?" Sinclair demanded, backing toward the easel. Distracted, Wendelane smiled, stepping over the threshold. "My father's men are securing the West Wing. It seems there is a breach in the defences. A perfect time for an unfortunate accident to befall the king's distraction. You would betray your own pack." Sinclair grabbed a jar of turpentine from the table, her hands shaking. "Rylan will kill you." "Rylan will mourn you," Wendelane corrected, advancing slowly. "And then he will rage. He will destroy your brother's army in his grief, and when the dust settles, he will need a queen to help him rebuild. A strong queen, not a broken Omega from a traitor bloodline." Wendelane lunged. Sinclair didn't think. She reacted with the desperation of a cornered animal. She threw the open jar of turpentine into Wendelane's face. The lady shrieked, clawing at her burning eyes. Sinclair didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy canvas, a painting of herself sleeping, and brought it down on Wendelane's head with a sickening crack of wood against bone. Wendelane crumbled to the floor, unconscious. Sinclair stood over her, chest heaving. The mouse had bitten back, but there was no time for victory. The sounds of battle were getting closer. Sinclair grabbed the dagger from Wendelane's limp hand. She didn't run to hide. She ran toward the stairs. The hum in her chest had turned into a scream. Rylan was in pain. She could feel it, a sharp, searing agony in her left shoulder. He had been hit. "I'm coming," she whispered to the stone walls, sprinting down the spiral staircase. She wasn't running away from the monster anymore. She was running to save him. The courtyard of the Obsidian Keep had been breached. The massive iron gates hung askew, battered open by a battering ram. The snow was stained crimson. Sinclair emerged from the keep into chaos. The air smelled of copper and wet fur. She ducked behind a fallen statue as two wolves, one grey, one brown, tore at each other inches from her. She scanned the battlefield, her soul acting as a compass. There. Near the broken gates, the massive black wolf was surrounded. Rylan was fighting with the ferocity of a demon, but he was tiring. A spear was lodged in his shoulder, the source of the pain Sinclair felt. Encircling him were a dozen elite soldiers bearing the Moorcrest crest, and behind them, safe on a horse, sat Thorn. "Finish him!" Thorn screamed, his face twisted in a rictus of greed. "The head of the Beast King brings a double share of gold." One of the mercenaries lunged with a silver-tipped pike. Rylan snarled, twisting to snap the weapon, but another soldier struck his flank. He went down on one knee, blood matted in his dark fur. "No!" The scream tore from Sinclair's throat before she could stop it. She broke cover. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a weapon other than the small dagger. She just had the blinding, overwhelming need to be between the spears and her mate. "Hold!" Thorn shouted, seeing her running across the blood-slicked stones. "The girl! Don't damage the merchandise!" The soldiers hesitated. That hesitation saved her life. Sinclair slid to a halt in front of the massive, heaving wolf. She turned her back to the beast, spreading her arms wide, facing her brother. "Sinclair!" Thorn laughed, though it sounded nervous. "Good girl. You escaped. Come here, Sin. Step away from the monster, and we can go home." "Home?" Sinclair's voice rang out, surprisingly steady over the din of battle. "You sold my home, Thorn. You sold me." "I did what I had to do for the pack," Thorn yelled, his eyes darting to the recovering wolf behind her. "You did it for yourself!" Sinclair cried. She looked at the soldiers surrounding them, men from her own lands, men she had grown up with. "Look at him. He hides behind you, while you die for his gold. Is this the Alpha you chose?" The soldiers glanced at each other. They looked at the terrified man on the horse, then at the small Omega standing unarmed in front of a giant, wounded predator to protect him. "Move, Sinclair!" Thorn panicked, drawing his sword. "I'll kill you myself if I have to." Behind her, Rylan growled, a sound that shook the earth. He began to rise, ignoring his wounds, ready to shield her with his last breath. But Sinclair didn't move. She felt a surge of power, heat rising from her belly, ancient and undeniable. It wasn't the power of a warrior, it was the power of the Omega, the peacemaker, the heart of the pack. "If you want him," Sinclair said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried on the wind, "you have to go through me." Thorn kicked his horse forward, raising his sword. "So be it." As the blade descended, a blur of motion intercepted him. Not Rylan. It was the Stonehaven Legion. Ulara Morwell, blooded but alive, led a fresh wave of warriors from the castle depths, slamming into the rear of Thorn's flank. At the same time, the soldiers closest to Thorn, the ones Sinclair had shamed, lowered their weapons. Thorn's sword faltered. In that second of distraction, Rylan lunged. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. The massive wolf leaped over Sinclair, a blur of shadow, and collided with Thorn's horse. Thorn was thrown into the mud. Before he could scramble up, a heavy paw pinned him to the earth. Rylan's jaws hovered inches from Thorn's throat, dripping saliva and blood. The battlefield went silent. The mercenaries, seeing their paymaster pinned, dropped their weapons. Rylan's golden eyes flicked to Sinclair. He was waiting. "Your call." Sinclair walked over to her brother. Thorn looked up at her, mud in his hair, terror in his eyes. "Sin, please," he whimpered. "We're family." Sinclair looked at the brother she had starved for. Then she looked at the wolf who had dreamed of her for 5 years. "Family doesn't sell family," Sinclair said softly. She looked at Rylan. "Don't kill him." Thorn slumped in relief. "Exile him," Sinclair finished, her voice cold. "Let him live with the knowledge that he had a kingdom and sold it for a sack of coins. Let him be a rogue, a ghost. Rylan chuffed, a sound of approval. He stepped off Thorn, then let out a roar that signaled the end of the war. The days following the battle were a blur of healing and rebuilding. The snow melted, washing away the blood, revealing the first green shoots of spring. Sinclair spent her time in the infirmary, but this time she wasn't the assistant. She was the center of the keep's attention. The pack had seen her on the battlefield. They had seen her stand before the Alpha to save him. The whispers of outsider had been replaced by a reverent title, Luna. Rylan was healing in the Sun Suite, her room. He refused to be anywhere else. Sinclair sat on the edge of the bed, changing the bandages on his shoulder. The spear wound was deep, but his wolf healing was already closing it. "You were foolish," Rylan grumbled, though his hand rested possessively on her knee. "Running onto a battlefield with a fruit knife." "It was a silver dagger," Sinclair corrected, tightening the linen. "And you were losing." "I was strategizing," Rylan lied, a smirk tugging at his lips. Sinclair paused. She traced the jagged scar running down his chest. "Does it still hurt?" "Only when you stop touching me," Rylan said, his voice dropping to that husky timbre that made her toes curl. He sat up, wincing slightly, and took her hands in his. The intensity in his amber eyes was no longer terrifying. It was home. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped object. Sinclair unwrapped it. It was a ring, but not a gemstone. It was a band of twisted black iron and silver, inlaid with a piece of raw moonstone that glowed with a faint inner light. "This is the ring of the Stonehaven matriarchs," Rylan said quietly. "My mother wore it. Her mother before her. It is not given lightly." He looked at her, his expression vulnerable. "Sinclair, I dreamed of you before I knew your name. But the reality of you, the bravery, the kindness, the fire, it is better than any dream. You are not a hostage. You are not a guest. You are my equal, my mate." Sinclair's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had given her the key to her own cage. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. "I have no dowry. My family name is disgraced." "You gave me my life," Rylan said fiercely, "and you gave me peace. That is worth more than any kingdom." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Will you stay?" Rylan asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Not because the door is locked, but because you choose to." Sinclair closed her eyes, feeling the hum in her chest settle into a steady, contented rhythm. The pulling was gone. She had arrived. "I choose you," she whispered. "Today. Tomorrow. Forever." Rylan kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of wildflowers, rain, and a promise kept. Sinclair Moorcrest was never just a girl sold for gold. She was the price of a prophecy, the balance to a beast's fury. In a world that tried to trade her like currency, she found her own value, not in the crown she eventually wore, but in the courage she found standing in the mud, defending the monster who loved her. Love, she learned, isn't about beautiful cages or perfect dreams. It's about finding the person who hands you the key and dares you to fly, knowing you'll always fly back to them. Rylan Stonehaven dreamed of a girl in the mist, but he woke up to a queen. And as for Thorn, they say on quiet nights, near the border of the Badlands, you can hear a lone wolf howling at the moon, crying for the family he sold and the sister who rose above him. But in the Obsidian Keep, the only sound is laughter, and the steady, beating heart of a pack made whole. If this story of fate, betrayal, and redemption moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of love that defies the odds.